Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to look at what is Scholasticism. Now, Scholasticism is a period of Western philosophy that spans from the beginnings of the Middle Ages to the beginnings of the Renaissance. Some claim that there is a coherent, singular philosophical position known as scholasticism. However, efforts to identify a unifying doctrine of the period have shown more heterogeneity than is expected. It is better to think of scholasticism as a collection of philosophical positions united by a common method and time period than a specific set of beliefs in the way you might think of empiricism or Epicureanism. The scholastic period of philosophy has been described in various ways. One way to describe it is that people in the Middle Ages had two very old books, the Bible and the works of Aristotle, and scholasticism was the project of trying to make those two texts agree with each other. Another way that it was described, very eloquently by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is combine classical pagan philosophy, mainly Greek, but also its Roman versions, with the new Christian religion. Season with a variety of flavorings from the Jewish and Islamic intellectual heritages. Stir and simmer for 1,300 years or more until done. So basically what's happening is you have a group of philosophers that are trying to reconcile classical philosophy in some way with Christian theology. The first evidence of scholastic tradition can be found in the works of Augustine and Boethius, following the fall of Rome. Many scholastic philosophers did not have direct access to Plato due to a lack of translations. However, many of his ideas lived on in this tradition through the works of Augustine. Boethius took on the project of trying to reconcile the works of Plato and Aristotle. He was successful in translating several of Aristotle's works, and is cited as the sole link between many of these works and Western philosophers for the first half of the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, he was executed before he could translate Plato. An execution that seriously impacted the trajectory of Western thought. Now, with the exception of a brief period of resurgence in the late 700s and early 800s called the Carolingian period, associated with Johannes Scotus Erugenia, not to be confused with another Scotus we'll talk about in a second, philosophy did not really see a resurgence for about half a century. The works of Anselm and Abelard following the turn of the millennium, heralded the change to come, though it's debated whether they should be called part of the scholastic tradition, given that they lacked the wider access to the works of Aristotle, and were still working under a Neoplatonic framework with limited distinctions between philosophy and theology. They're sometimes identified as early scholastics or completely separate from the scholastics, but sometimes are treated as more similar to kind of early medieval philosophers, going back to the very few philosophers that existed in the time period before scholasticism really kicked off. As institutions of education were rebuilt, particularly in new universities, a renewed emphasis was placed on translating classical works lost to time, and there was a boom in works of philosophy. Of particular note was the complete translation, revival, and honoring of the philosophical works of Aristotle. This period of quote-unquote high scholasticism is the one most commonly associated with the term scholastic. Top philosophers of this time were Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, and John Duns Scotus, not to be confused with the other Scotus that we talked about earlier. John Buridan was also of note, though he lacked a religious order to espouse his ideas, and so many of his contributions are often forgotten. The reason we cannot articulate one doctrine of scholasticism is that these figures disagreed with each other and did not offer one view on many different questions. While they took the same methods of kind of trying to reconcile Aristotle in these classical works with the Bible and agreed generally on some points, they proclaimed very much their own unique individual philosophies. Broadly, Dominicans were Thomists, while Franciscans were Occamists, Scotists, and Bonaventurists. These religious orders then carried on these traditions into what was known as the late Scholastic period in the following of these different philosophers, which deeply did disagree with each other. And this kind of period of late scholasticism lasted until the rise of humanism, rationalism, and empiricism with the early modern period and the Renaissance. This period is where a tradition of scholasticism starts to be identified to separate it from early modern philosophical positions, despite its internal disagreements, because those early modern positions were very different and often took a more critical eye than some of the scholastics did to the religious texts that were there, though not exclusively. Scholasticism saw another revival in the form of the Neo-Scholastics that gained prevalence in the 18 and 1900s. This was a backlash to what was called modernism by the Catholic Church, referred to by the Catholic Church as the sum of all heresies. Thomism and other Neo-Scholastic philosophers were held up as alternatives to the modernism espoused by Renaissance humanists and Enlightenment philosophers which advocated democracy and science in place of rule by the church. This gave neo-scholastics a strong incentive to paper over some of the disagreements between the scholastic philosophers and present scholasticism inaccurately as a united front and movement traceable to the Middle Ages. While we can draw some broad contrasts between scholastic thought and early modern thought, and there were some important changes that happened in the early modern period that didn't exist really for many of the scholastics in terms of their thought. That doesn't mean that the scholastics all agreed with each other or weren't actively having debates or representing different camps. Simply that they might be closer together than they were to some of the early modern philosophers. Though that's not a complete and perfect picture. So this distinction of scholastics fits more with a time period and a methodology than a certain way of thought. And if you find any neo-scholastics that try to convince you otherwise, I suggest you share this video with them. Check out our videos on Anselm and Aquinas for more on the specific beliefs of some scholastic philosophers from very different time periods, Anselm coming from very early in the process, Aquinas coming from kind of high scholasticism and lasting much later than many of the other works. Stay tuned for a future video on Renaissance humanism, and as well as hopefully videos on civic humanism and modern humanism. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.